Today we're still in the midst of our Lenten message series, Project Shalom. We're talking about how we are invited to be part of God's Shalom project in the world, to bring peace to the world, to bring oneness and wholeness to the world. And we've been talking about how we help that and also how sometimes we participate in things that disrupt that shalom. And I've invited you to answer this question this morning. If we didn't call it the kingdom of God, what else would we call it? What other word could we use? And I've had some interesting suggestions here this morning. We have the family of God. That's come up a number of times. The life of God, the creation of God, the sanctuary of God, the eternity of God, the world of God, the shalom of God instead of the kingdom of God, the love of God. Somebody says the squad of God. The realm of God. Beth McClanahan says the bailiwick of God. Is that of Scottish origin, that word? I'm not sure. Might be. The bailiwick of God. I like that. The work of God. The peace of God. The home of God. The heart of God. Any others out there? What's that? The garden of God. The presence. The what? The Commonwealth. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. Those are all really wonderful suggestions, and I do think sometimes we struggle with this word kingdom because it's sort of archaic. We don't live in a kingdom. Some people don't like it because it's patriarchal, and they've changed it to the kingdom of God, so it's not just male-centered. And all of those, I think, are helpful, and I think we need to have different ways of talking about the kingdom of God. But I also want to suggest today we need to hold on to this word kingdom because Jesus uses it for some pretty particular reasons. The word kingdom in his time had a very political sense to it. He was making a political statement when he referred to the kingdom of God as being something that exists over and against the kingdom of Rome. Sometimes they said we would interpret this as the empire of God and the empire of Rome, or in Greek, the basileia of God or the basileia of Rome. And so we want to hold on to the implicit political content that's in that word kingdom, and it shows up in our text today. So keep that in mind as I read this passage from John chapter 18. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate answered him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." So Pilate asked him, "Okay, what is the truth?" And after he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no case against him, but you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" And they, the crowd, shouted in reply, "Not this man, but Barabbas." And Barabbas was a bandit. So I have a strange question for you this morning. It might seem strange. Have you ever been to the kingdom of God? Have you ever traveled to the kingdom of God? And I don't mean this metaphorically. I mean, well, maybe I do in a sense. If you got out your passport and I looked at all the stamps from the places around the world you traveled, would I find a stamp there that showed that at some point you had traveled, visited the kingdom of God? Now, I know some of us here don't have passports, so let me ask this in a different way. How many immigrants do we have here today? Few people raised their hand. What if I told you that all of you are immigrants? I mean, everybody here who professes to be a citizen of the kingdom of God, what if I told you that automatically makes you an immigrant in the kingdoms of the world? It makes you a stranger in a strange land. It makes you a resident alien. How would you feel about that if I said you're an immigrant too? often in Jesus' teachings, one way or another, he's trying to get people to think about the question, are you a citizen of the kingdoms of the world, or are you a citizen of the kingdom of God? In today's text, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. But what did he mean by that? We often think we know what he meant by that, but could it be possible that we've been wrong all this time? You might have heard the news this week that the body of 34-year-old Michael Sharp was found buried in a shallow grave in the Congolese jungle. Michael, 34, was this white guy from Kansas. What was he doing in the jungles of the Congolese? Well, he was there as part of a Mennonite group traveling into the Congo in one of the most violent places in the world right now. There are so many groups, factious groups, fighting each other there. In the last several decades, millions of people have either been displaced or murdered in this fighting, some of it at the hands of the corrupt government there. And Michael left Kansas to go there at the behest of the Mennonite Central Committee to do work. He and his group, this church group of Mennonites, would literally walk unarmed into the jungles of the Congo in order to encounter the rebels that were fighting there. He would walk into their midst and sit down and talk with them, listen to their story, and try his best to convince them that what they were doing by participating in this violence, they were destroying their countries, they were destroying their homes, they were destroying their families. What he was trying to do was to convince them to leave the violence behind and to walk out of the jungle and go home. And what's surprising about this 34-year-old white guy from Kansas is how good he was at this. How responsive these rebels were to listening to what he had to say, to the vision that he put before them of a different way. In fact, it's estimated that some 1,600 rebels walked with him and his group, left behind their arms, walked out of the jungle, went home to their friends and their families and their villages, and left the violence behind. Michael was so good at this that the United Nations Security Council, when he was done doing his work with the Mennonites, enlisted him to come with them to go to a particular hotspot of violence to try to effect some good there. And on March 12th of this year, Michael and his team disappeared in the jungle. And Monday, the news began reporting that his body and the body of a Swedish counterpart of his had been found in a shallow grave, victims of violence. So in the days that have followed, a lot of people have been lauding the work that he's done, the difference that he made in the world. But you have to know there are people that read that story, as I did, and said, who did this guy think he was? What did he think he was doing, a guy from Kansas going into the jungles of the Congo unarmed and thinking he could make a difference? What world did he think he was living in? Who did he think he was? Now, I don't know this for a fact, but I have to imagine that Michael knew exactly who he was. He knew that he was an immigrant in this world. He knew that he was a stranger in a strange land, a resident alien. He knew that he was called to live differently in the world than the way that the world was calling him to live. The same questions that we might put to somebody like a Michael Sharp, who do you think you are? What world do you think you're living in? Are really the same questions that Pilate puts to Jesus in this text today from the Gospel of John. Recall that Jesus has been arrested by Jewish religious elite authorities. He's been taken before Pilate, who is a representative of the Roman government. And Pilate begins this conversation with Jesus, according to John's portrayal of this, and says, "Are you a king?" And Jesus won't answer the question because Jesus knows that what Pilate thinks a king is and how Jesus might understand that are entirely different things. That we're about to see that Jesus' kingship is about to play itself out as an act of self-giving, self-sacrificing love on the cross. And so instead, Jesus' response to Pilate is, "My kingdom is not of this world." Now, often we hear that phrase, "My kingdom is not of this world," or "not from this world," and we understand that to be that Jesus is saying, "My kingdom is of some heavenly, ethereal, otherworldly realm that has nothing to do with the everyday life that you and I are leading down here. It is a realm that's completely separate and unsullied by the everydayness of the lives we lead. Now, absolutely, there is some content when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God as being something having to do with the heavenly realm, with what we might call the afterlife. But remember what I said earlier, there's a reason Jesus uses this term kingdom of God. He is purposely using a very earthly term, a political term. Jesus is saying, my kingdom, the kingdom of God, inhabits exactly the same temporal space as all the kingdoms of the world that you have constructed for yourselves, but it looks nothing like them. It doesn't share the same values. It doesn't share the same assumptions. It doesn't share the same tactics or goals. It looks completely different. And so, he says to Pilate, here's an example. If my kingdom were of this world, if it were like the kingdoms of this world, then my followers would have come when I was arrested and used violence to bring me back. They'd be using it right now, but they didn't, and they're not, because my kingdom is not like the kingdoms of this world. Now, Pilate's response to this is, oh, so you did say you're a king then, if you have a kingdom. And Jesus basically responds, well, you believe whatever you want, but I came here to bring the truth. And so Pilate asks another question, okay, what is this truth? And Jesus doesn't answer because Jesus again knows that what Pilate thinks truth is and what Jesus knows truth is are two entirely different things. Because in the Gospel of John, truth is not some set of beliefs. It's not some proposition or assumptions that you believe in. Like that's probably what Pilate thinks truth is. In the Gospel of John, you don't see Jesus walking around teaching truth to people. He embodies the truth. He is the truth. He lives the truth. Jesus is saying, the truth is the way, the life that I lead, that is the truth. If Pilate wants to know the truth, it's standing right in front of him. It's a way of life that leads you deep into the jungles of the heart of God, the shalom, the peace of God, if you dare to go there. So Pilate's response then is he goes out to this group, and this is in John's version of the story now. He goes out to this group of Jews that are gathered there and says, okay, it's a custom that I'm supposed to release one of the prisoners that I have here during the Passover. Which one do you want it to be? It can be Jesus or it can be this guy Barabbas over here. Which do you choose? Do you choose Jesus, the peaceful pacifist, or do you choose Barabbas, the violent insurrectionist? And have no doubt, to the Romans, Barabbas was a terrorist. To the Jews, he would have been considered a rebel hero. And who do the people pick? Which one do they select? The peaceful Jesus or the violent Barabbas? Which one do they shout? Barabbas. And John's just foreshadowing what he knows is going to happen later. The people do choose violence. They walk away from the peace of Jesus. They choose a violent insurrection against Rome. And what happens? They're slaughtered. Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. They choose violence. And they see what they get. So where does this leave us sitting here today? We live in just as violent a world as the people did then. We live in a kingdom that at times uses violence at our behest to protect us. Might we say that sometimes violence is necessary? Might we say sometimes violence is for the common good? It's helpful? Would we say, Jesus, you got it wrong on violence? Or would Jesus say, no, you got it wrong? I think that question matters to us as people of faith, right? Because again, when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, he's not always talking about something metaphorical or spiritual. He's also talking about the here and now. So when we go to Jesus and say, Jesus, look, it's a violent world. That's just the way it is. Jesus might respond to us, yes, true, but it doesn't have to be that way. You could choose to live a different way in the world that you live in right now. I wonder what allows a person like a Michael Sharp to go into the jungles of the Congo unarmed in the midst of violence. And I wonder it's because he could see a different reality than the people there in the midst of the violence could not. He could see that he was living in the kingdom of God in their midst, the peace of God, the shalom of God. And so we're left with a big question this morning. Where is our citizenship? Is it in the kingdoms of this world, or is it in the kingdom of God? Because as I read the text, often what Jesus is trying to say to us is, it's not that you can say, I live in the kingdom of God, I'm a citizen of the kingdom of God first, and then I'm a citizen of the kingdom of the world. Jesus says, no, it's all in. You have to be all in for the kingdom of God 100%. Because this is the truth about these two kinds of kingdoms, the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of the world. Both of them want you, body and soul. Both of them want our complete allegiance and fidelity, and both of them promise that if we'll engage in them, they will change who we are as people. So, if this morning you opened your spiritual passport and you gazed at all the places you've traveled, what would it tell you about which kingdom you're living in? Are you traveling to places of power and authority and status? Or are you traveling to places where you are in solidarity with the meek and the lowly and the disenfranchised and the outcast and the oppressed? Because Jesus tells us, and it's a hard saying of the gospel, you can't live in both worlds, because my kingdom is not of this world. I want to give you a little time now to reflect on this. I've laid a lot of questions out here this morning and things to think about. If you look on the back of your insert in the bulletin, there's a box with a few questions that might be helpful to your time of reflection. But I'd invite you just to consider right now, what does all this mean to you? This talk of the kingdom of God over and against the kingdom of the world, that the kingdom of God might be something you could experience right now in your midst, that you don't have to wait for it. Perhaps you'll use this time to pray, to doodle, to write something down in that box. Let's just take a few minutes to do that, and then I will close us in prayer.